This episode is about Elisa Lam. It's about a young woman who traveled to California in January of 2013, who ran a blog, who wrote honestly about bipolar disorder and the feeling of being behind, who disappeared from a downtown Los Angeles hotel, and whose last moments on camera became a global obsession. I'm Natalie Cheng. I'm a journalist, and today I'll be talking with Dr. Marcus Hale, a forensic psychologist who's worked in hospitals and emergency settings and who spent years thinking about how psychosis unfolds in real-world places. Marcus, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Natalie. It's good to be here. I know this case sits at the intersection of grief, media spectacle, and clinical reality. And I'm glad we can try to hold all of those at once without flattening Elisa into a mystery.
Right. Before we get into the theories and the elevator footage and the Cecil Hotel's history, and we will, I want to start the episode by putting Elisa first. She was Elisa Lam, Lam Ho Yi, born April 30, 1991, in Vancouver, daughter of Hong Kong immigrants, a university student, a writer with a fashion blog, Tumblr posts full of books, mood, and very human anxieties. Marcus, you read some of her writing. What struck you?
What struck me was how literate and candid she was. She wrote about depression, bipolar disorder, loneliness, about feeling behind her peers. She wasn't a caricature. She was thoughtful, creative, sometimes melancholic. There are lines that read like someone trying to map themselves. That voice matters because it resists the temptation to make her only an object of speculation.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that for listeners, because so often the storytelling around this case turned her into a spookier thing, a ghost story, a puzzle. But she was a person with family, parents who ran a restaurant in Vancouver, a sister, and she called them regularly while traveling until she stopped. Okay, quick framing. Our episode will move through the timeline of her trip, the peculiar elevator footage from January 31, the discovery of her body in a rooftop water tank on February 19th, the coroner's ruling, and then the enormous wave of online speculation and documentary treatment that followed. Sound good?
Yes, and I want us to keep returning to two lenses, clinical plausibility and systemic context. The clinical answers don't erase the mystery of subjective experience, what she was actually thinking, but they do constrain what's likely and what isn't.
Good. Then let's start with the place, the Cecil Hotel. It opened in 1924 as an ornate hotel, marble lobby, stained glass. Over decades, the neighborhood declined, and the building became a single-room occupancy hotel, SRO, close to Skid Row. By the 1980s and later, it had a reputation. Suicides, violent deaths, even connections to convicted serial killers who lived there at points. They called it the Suicide Hotel. But Marcus, can we quickly separate the documented history from the mythology that later surrounded Elisa's case?
Absolutely. The Cecil's history is complex. There are documented suicides and violent crimes, and there were notorious people who stayed there, Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger among them. That concrete history fed a cultural mythology. But mythologizing a place doesn't change the forensic facts about a particular death. Context matters. The hotel is in a neighborhood with extreme poverty, housing instability, and many people with untreated mental illness. But myth-making tends to amplify fear, not understanding.
Right. So this is important. When we talk about the Cecil, we're also talking about Skid Row, decades of deinstitutionalization, and how the city used hotels like the Cecil as housing of last resort. Okay, timeline. Elisa traveled to California in late January 2013. She visited San Diego, then arrived in Los Angeles and checked into the Cecil Stay on Main on January 28. She stayed first in a shared room with young women who complained about strange and unpredictable behavior and asked staff to move her. She was moved to a private room. On January 31, she's captured by the hotel elevator camera. This becomes the video the world watches.
The elevator footage is what most people know. It's grainy CCTV, time-stamped January 31. In it, a woman, Elisa, presses multiple buttons, peers out of the open door, hides in corners, moves her hands in unusual ways, steps out of the elevator briefly, then returns. The car's doors stay open an unusually long time and then close. That footage was released by LAPD on February 13. It went viral almost instantly.
Let's describe that carefully for listeners who might not want to watch it. She's wearing a red hoodie, a skirt or shorts, sandals. She walks into the elevator, stands in a corner, presses buttons, seems to peer out through the open doors, like she's checking something, then steps back and flattens herself against a wall. At one point, she steps out and makes very odd hand and arm movements. Some people have described them as talking to someone outside the frame or performing a gesture. The doors stay open for a long time, and the elevator doesn't move. Then she exits, the doors close, the elevator goes on. It's unnerving. Different people see different things.
Right. And we have to acknowledge our tendency as humans to impose narrative on ambiguity. People want a visible cause. Clinically, those behaviors can be consistent with an acute psychotic episode, responding to internal stimuli, disorganized motor patterns, fear or paranoia, attempts to hide. That doesn't prove anything beyond the footage, but it's a plausible reading that aligns with her medical history.
Let me interrupt. You said responding to internal stimuli. Can you unpack that for listeners? What does that look like?
Sure. In psychosis, people can hear voices or see things that aren't there. They might move their head as if looking at someone in the room, or make gestures to an unseen interlocutor. Motor behavior can seem childlike or frantic, flattening against walls, peeking as if checking for danger. Someone not trained might interpret those movements as theatrical or weird, but from a clinical standpoint, they're often attempts to cope with perceived threats or to communicate with hallucinated voices. Motor behavior can seem childlike or frantic, flattening against walls, peeking as if checking for danger. Someone not trained might interpret those movements as theatrical or weird, but from a clinical standpoint, they're often attempts to cope with perceived threats or to communicate with hallucinated voices.
Listeners, I want to be clear. We are not offering a final verdict on the elevator footage. We're offering explanations that fit the evidence and the background. After the elevator video, Elisa's family reported she hadn't responded to her usual calls, and on February 8th, they filed a missing persons report with LAPD. Searches happened in the hotel, police dogs, the roof was searched. No one thought to open the water tanks at first. Then, on February 19th, a maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez went up to check complaints about water low pressure, discolored tap water, and discovered Elisa's body in one of the rooftop water tanks. She was nude, her clothes and personal items were found in the tank with her.
The discovery raised immediate questions. How did she get to the roof? How did she get into the tank? Why was she naked? Was there evidence of foul play? The coroner's office conducted an autopsy and toxicology. The final ruling, issued in June 2013, was accidental drowning with bipolar disorder listed as a significant condition contributing to the death.
And that ruling, for a huge number of people online, was unacceptable. Which brings us to the wave of conspiracy theories and web sleuthing. But before we go there, Marcus, Can you walk us through the autopsy findings that are important to understanding why the coroner reached that conclusion?
The key points from the autopsy. There was no evidence of physical trauma consistent with a violent assault. No broken bones, no internal injuries. There were no signs of sexual assault. Toxicology showed therapeutic or subtherapeutic levels of prescribed psychiatric medications. Importantly, there were no illicit drugs detected and alcohol was not significant. In context, those subtherapeutic medication levels suggest possible undermedication or non-compliance with treatment, which increases risk of relapse into mania or psychosis.
Right. And investigators and other reporters have noted that rooftop water tanks at the Cecil were reachable via fire escape and exterior ladders. There were hatches that could be opened by a single person. Hotel staff said the lids were heavy but liftable. Maintenance and investigators recreated the scenario and demonstrated it was physically possible for an adult to get into and out of the tanks. Well, into them. Getting out was the problem. Marcus, what about the clothing? Many people saw them as proof of foul play, someone taking her clothes off or forcing them off.
There are several plausible explanations for the clothes being in the tank. Wet clothing can become a serious impediment to staying afloat. Someone who's panicked or in water may remove waterlogged garments instinctively to keep from sinking or to free movement. Also, perceptual disturbances in psychosis, feeling cold or hot, misperceiving the environment, could lead someone to remove clothes. The key here is that the coroner found no trauma, suggesting a struggle or sexual assault. The presence of her clothes in the tank is consistent with a voluntary act amid severe disorientation, not necessarily proof of external force.
Now, the online response? This is where the story exploded into something much louder and often cruel. The elevator footage was dissected on YouTube, Reddit, and countless blogs. People suggested that the tape was edited to remove another person. They pointed to timestamp glitches, to a blurred corner of the frame, to the long-held open doors as proof of a hidden presence. Others floated supernatural readings, possession, ghosts, the hotel's dark aura. Marcus, why do people prefer those narratives?
There are psychological reasons. One is that mental illness is deeply stigmatized and uncomfortable. Saying someone died because psychosis led them to an unsafe situation demands empathy and structural responsibility, accessible mental health care, safer housing, better building security. Conspiracy and supernatural options are simpler in one sense. They externalize blame and are more narratively satisfying. Also, ambiguous visual stimuli invite projection. Viewers fill in what the camera can't show. That's human, but it can become harmful, especially when it turns into harassment.
It absolutely did. A musician who once stayed at the Cecil, Pablo Vergara, known online as Morbid, faced intense harassment and death threats after people falsely suggested he was involved. That's one concrete harm of armchair sleuthing. Another is the sheer re-victimization of Elisa's family, who had their daughter's last known moments broadcast and debated endlessly. Marcus, where should responsible curiosity stop and moral responsibility begin when people consume true crime?
Responsible curiosity stops at speculation without evidence. Moral responsibility begins with remembering the human beings involved, naming them as people with histories. If you're going to analyze footage, do so with an understanding of the limits of what the footage can tell you. Don't dox, don't threaten, don't invent. And when the most plausible explanation is clinical, in this case bipolar disorder with a likely psychotic episode, consider what that explanation implies about prevention rather than insisting on villainy for narrative comfort.
That's a crucial point. The Netflix docuseries Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel came out in 2021 and reignited the case. It brought global attention back to the Cecil, but it also drew heavy criticism for amplifying web sleuths and sensational angles at the expense of Elisa's voice and dignity. Marcus, you've watched the series. What did it get right and what did it miss?
It did some important things. It highlighted the hotel's history and the conditions of Skid Row, and it did include experts who spoke about bipolar disorder. But its structure gave a lot of airtime to speculative online commentators, which had the effect of normalizing and validating conspiracy interpretations. That framing can delegitimize the clinical realities and the coroner's findings, and it often sidelines the lived experience of the family and of people with the illness.
And that leads to a broader conversation about why the unsolved appeal is so powerful. For many, an unresolved mystery is attractive because it allows endless engagement. YouTube algorithms love it. But in the Elisa Lam case, many of the questions people obsess over may be unanswerable. What exactly she thought in those final hours? Why she chose the tank? The precise timeline on the roof? Are we comfortable with ambiguity, Marcus?
We have to tolerate ambiguity. Clinical work is full of it. We rarely get a full transcript of someone's inner line of reasoning. What we can do is triangulate her documented diagnosis of bipolar disorder, social history of prior psychotic episodes per family report, the behavior on the elevator consistent with responding to internal stimuli, toxicology showing subtherapeutic medication levels, and a building with accessible but dangerous rooftop tanks. Put together, these elements create a coherent, evidence-based explanation that doesn't require introducing a second person or supernatural elements.
That's the heart of the case for me. It's less satisfying as entertainment, but it's far more devastating because it points to structural failures, fragmented mental health care, housing that exposes vulnerable people to hazards, a society that sensationalizes rather than systems that support. Let's talk about those structural pieces a bit more. The Cecil is in the shadow of Skid Row, which at times has been home to tens of thousands of unhoused people within a small radius. Decades of deinstitutionalization meant many people with serious mental illness ended up without supports. Marcus, how does that context increase the risk for someone like Elisa?
The context matters a lot. If you have a severe mood disorder and you're traveling, your routines and supports are disrupted. If you're under-medicated or miss doses, the risk for relapse increases. Add unfamiliar sleep schedules, stress, and being alone in an environment where access to immediate, compassionate psychiatric care is limited, and you have risk factors converging. Moreover, buildings like the Cecil were not designed with people in crisis in mind. They mix short-term tourists with long-term residents experiencing homelessness and mental illness. That mix can create situations where someone in distress is invisible or ignored until it's too late.
Which brings us to practical questions. Could better building safety or better search protocols have saved her? LAPD dogs were used in the initial search. They reportedly didn't open the tanks. Some people say that's incompetence, or worse. Marcus, your take?
From a procedural standpoint, investigators search where evidence suggests a body might be found: rooms, basements, common areas. The idea of checking water tanks for a missing adult is unusual unless there's specific reason to suspect tampering or foul play. Hindsight makes it look obvious, but at the time there was no evidence suggesting she'd been placed in a tank. That said, the episode exposes how our built environment and routine search protocols can miss rare but fatal possibilities. It's a system failure in a broad sense. Buildings with accessible hazards and investigative practices that rarely anticipate certain outcomes. It's a system failure.
The coroner's office said the tank lids could be opened by one person. Hotel employees and maintenance replicated such scenarios. That's important because many online theories claimed tanks were sealed and impossible to enter. But Marcus, what about the idea of a cover-up, that someone edited the elevator footage to hide another person?
Technical artifacts in timestamps and compression can create oddities in footage. Unless someone presents verifiable, time-coded original footage with evidence of manipulation, claims of deliberate editing remain speculative. Importantly, for a cover-up to be credible, we'd need corroborating evidence. Bruises, DNA, witness testimony, none of which was found or reported by investigators. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence hasn't surfaced.
Listeners, I want to pause and underscore that saying the most plausible explanation is clinical or accidental is not the same as saying her death is unimportant or that the system bears no blame. It's quite the opposite. Marcus, earlier you said we need to move from narrative hunger to structural questions. What are concrete changes that might reduce the risk of similar tragedies?
Several things. First, better continuity of care for people with severe mental illness, meaning outreach, assertive community treatment teams, medication support when people are traveling. Second, safer building practices in places that house vulnerable populations, locks on hazardous access points, regular checks of unusual spaces, staff trained to de-escalate and to see distressed guests as people needing help, not entertainment. Third, better public health frameworks that link housing to behavioral health services. And fourth, law enforcement practices that include mental health professionals during welfare checks and missing person searches when appropriate.
Those are important. I also want to explore the harm done by the public spectacle. Elisa's family watched their daughter's last known moments be chopped into endless clips and speculative narrations. Innocent people were harassed. Marcus, do you see any ethical guidelines budding in the online true crime community? Or are we still in a Wild West phase?
There's some progress. More creators now talk about consent with families or focus on systemic lessons instead of lurid detail. But platforms still reward sensationalism. We need stronger norms. Call out doxing. Avoid identifying unverified suspects. Center the deceased dignity, and, whenever possible, link coverage to resources for mental health and homelessness. That shift requires both creators' ethics and platform-level incentives that don't monetize outrage exclusively.
I'd like to read something from Elisa's blog, paraphrased, not quoted verbatim, because I think it illustrates what we're talking about. She wrote about feeling behind and anxious, but also about hope and making plans. There are lines that say she wanted to be better and wanted to be seen. Does that change how we listen to the case?
It should. It humanizes her. When a subject of a viral clip also leaves behind words revealing vulnerability and aspiration, treating the case as only a riddle is callous. The clinical framing is not meant to erase her voice. It's meant to contextualize it so her death is not turned into entertainment, but into a prompt for empathy and systems change.
Now, there are some questions that remain probably unanswerable. We will likely never know the exact content of her hallucinations, if she had them, or why she chose the tank specifically. But there are other questions that the internet likes to act as if they're unsolved mysteries when they're not. Was there evidence of homicide? The autopsy said no. Could she physically get into the tank alone? Yes. Is a supernatural explanation necessary? No. Marcus, final forensic takeaways in plain language.
Plainly, there was no forensic evidence of a struggle or third-party violence. Toxicology didn't show intoxication or illicit substances. Medications were lower than therapeutic, suggesting she may not have been reliably medicated. And combined with her prior psychiatric history, her behavior on camera, and the building hazards, the coroner's conclusion of accidental drowning with bipolar disorder as a contributing factor is medically and forensically plausible.
Thank you. Before we close, I want to spend a few minutes on the harm of looping a case like this indefinitely for clicks. Families suffer. Innocent people get harassed, and people with mental illness see their symptoms turned into spooky spectacle. So, for listeners who are moved by this story and want to be responsible consumers, 3 quick points. 1. Remember the person. 2. Avoid doxing and do not participate in harassment. 3. If you want to help, support local mental health and housing organizations rather than fueling speculation. Marcus, any additions?
I'd add, if someone's behavior in public looks dangerous rather than criminal, think in terms of welfare and crisis intervention, not entertainment. And if you're fascinated by the clinical side, read peer-reviewed work on bipolar disorder and crisis care. Avoid clickbait channels that trade on mystique.
For resources, if you or someone you know is in crisis, please contact your local emergency services or crisis hotline. In the U.S., people can dial 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. In Canada, there are provincial lines and resources through mental health organizations. We'll put resource links in the episode notes. Marcus, any final reflection on Elisa as a person?
Remember her as a young woman who wrote honestly about life and illness. Let her blog posts, her photos from the zoo in San Diego, and the reality of her family's grief anchor the conversation. Clinical explanation shouldn't dehumanize. It should deepen our responsibility to prevent future tragedies.
That's a good place to end. Thank you, Marcus, for being measured and humane about this. For listeners, thank you for listening and for holding these complexities with us. If you were disturbed by this episode, take care of yourself. Be gentle. We'll be back next week with another story. And until then, remember the person behind the footage.
Thank you, Natalie. And to listeners, if this episode stirred you, reach out to someone. No one should carry these feelings alone. Take care.
This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Natalie Chang. Our guest was Dr. Marcus Hale. Production notes. We relied on public reporting, coroner's findings, and Elisa's public writing to shape this episode. We aimed to avoid sensationalism and to center dignity. If you have feedback or corrections, we welcome it. Contact us through the show page. Good night.